In this short video, we are going to talk about equipment tests. The importance of these tests is often underestimated, although they are the basic requirement of any meaningful step drawdown pumping test, which in turn provides the data needed to design sustainable exploitation schemes. An equipment test takes only a few hours, but is key to sustainable extraction over decades. So make sure you don't skip this step and make sure it's done properly. One objective of an equipment test is to ensure that all the appropriate equipment is on site and prepared for the pumping test. But the other major objective is to design the flow rates of the step drawdown pumping test. The starting point of an equipment test is the maximum admissible drawdown, defined in advance by the well characteristic criteria, while the maximum flow rate, Qmax, is the main result of an equipment test. So let's start with defining the maximum admissible drawdown. There are three criteria we use for this purpose: the position of the pump, the position of the screens, and a rule of thumb, which is a third of the saturated thickness or a maximum of 30 meters of drawdown. If you don't know these characteristics from the borehole record, it is highly recommended you obtain them from a borehole camera inspection. The first criterion is the position of the pump. Depending on the well design, the pump position may vary. However, it must never be placed at the bottom of the borehole or below the lowest screens, unless it's equipped with a sleeve, and should never be placed within the screen sections. To have a safety factor, 2 meters are added to the position of the pump, yielding the maximum admissible drawdown regarding this criteria. The second criterion is the position of the first screen. The water level should never drop below or into the screen sections, since air will be introduced into the aquifer, and this can lead to precipitation of minerals, clogging and biofouling. The third criterion is not exact science, it is only based on experience. It is very useful in cases when the first two criteria cannot be met. This is a rule of thumb restricting the maximum admissible drawdown to a third of the saturated thickness of the borehole, or to a maximum of about 30 meters. Experience has shown that pumping tests with drawdowns exceeding these values are usually significantly over-dimensioned, yielding data which cannot be exploited. Combining the three criteria yields the maximum admissible drawdown, which is defined by the smallest value of the three criteria, as shown in these examples. With the maximum admissible drawdown defined, we can now carry out the equipment test using it as target of the test. The flow rate which is associated with this water level is the maximum flow rate Qmax, which is the value we are seeking. A very tricky part of an equipment test is the choice of an appropriate pump, especially in a new borehole. Choose a pump covering the range corresponding to the driller's estimate during the well development. Or if you have any information on surrounding well yields, you can also use that information. But it is highly recommended to carry along at least 2 pumps covering different flow rate ranges. Start the test at the pump's full capacity while monitoring the water level stabilization, and check if you achieve the maximum admissible drawdown. If you overshoot that value, you have to throttle the pump and reduce the flow rate. Keep adjusting the valve by trial and error until the target water level is reached. When that is achieved, the associated flow rate corresponds to the maximum flow rate of the well, Qmax, which also corresponds to the highest flow rate of the step drawdown pumping test. If the valve has to be throttled by more than 30% of the pump's maximum flow rate, then the pump is too powerful. You then have to install a smaller pump and repeat the test. If the maximum admissible drawdown is not reached, you should consider repeating the test with a more powerful pump. The maximum flow rate allows us to design the flow rates of the step drawdown pumping test by dividing it by the number of steps to ensure a homogeneous distribution across the full range. The designed flow rates of the step drawdown test are indicative and do not need to be very precise. Each flow rate is then found experimentally by adjusting the valve, clearly marking the positions on the valve so that the setup is ready for a successful step drawdown test to be carried out the next day when the static water level has completely recovered. That's all there is to this equipment test. It sounds easy, but it's not always easy to carry out in the field. But putting effort into this test assures high quality pumping tests, allowing design of sustainable water schemes.